We've got some exciting things to talk to you about this evening and to show you. Notice the statement by Dr. Herzog, who's professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. He says, "This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel." That's what we've learned from the study of archaeology. Now, why would a fellow who is professor of archaeology in Israel make a statement like that? We have to put this in a larger political context. And I think we can see that context if we compare it with a statement made by the late Yasser Arafat, who is former president of the Palestinian Authority. And I think you can appreciate why he would make a statement similar to this. He says the notion of a Jewish origin in Jerusalem is a religious myth used to justify occupation and colonialism. Well, he's fighting a political battle. He says there never was a temple in Jerusalem, and there's no archaeological evidence anywhere this is a myth. We want to see what the evidence is for the Bible, for the history of Israel, from the stones of Israel. And I want to begin with the altar of Joshua, and I believe that's exactly what it is, on Mount Ebal. In Deuteronomy 27, we find the instructions given: when you've crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones about which I'm commanding you today on Mount Ebal, and you shall cover them with plaster. Build an altar to the Lord with an altar of stones on which you've not used an iron tool. And so it's a very specific type of altar. They wrote the law in the plaster. They were excellent stone cutters at this time, just phenomenal stone cutters, but no stones that were cut were to be used here. Verse 11 says, the same day Moses charged the people as follows: when you've crossed over, you'll stand on the Mount Gerizim for a blessing. Then verse 13 says you'll stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. This is a good teaching method. We're going to read you the law. Now then, here's half of the group on this mountain and half of the group on the other mountain, and you're going to recite what's going to happen if you keep this law, and then the others are going to recite what's going to happen if you don't keep this law. And here are the blessings, here are the cursings. They understood exactly what happened, and of course we see those things taking place as they obeyed or as they didn't obey. But this altar was the center of that event. This is up in Samaria, and here we can see Mount Ebal and nearby Mount Gerizim. Dr. Adam Zertal is chairman, or was chairman, of the Department of Archaeology at the University of Haifa. He was an atheist. He was taught in his education that Joshua, Moses, David, Solomon were all fictitious creatures like Zeus, and you don't believe this foolishness. But he's an archaeologist, and he begins to look at what you can find from archaeology, and he took the area of Manasseh, and over a period of about 20 years was doing a survey, meter by meter, of that area to see what could be found. And he found an altar. Well, nobody was ready to admit this was an altar on Mount Gerizim. They'd looked on top, and it wasn't there. And so they assumed the altar that you read about in Deuteronomy wasn't there. Of course, the high places were reserved for the idols. You study the Old Testament. Literally, it says this altar was in the mountain. It's about 2/3 of the way up. And when he came across this doing his survey, he reported it in the journals. Could this be Joshua's altar? And there was just a guffaw, just ridicule. Lawrence Staggers, professor of archaeology of Israel at Harvard University, says, if a sacrificial altar stood on Mount Ebal, its impact on our research is revolutionary. All of us have to go back to kindergarten. Because they're teaching that none of this happened. There's no Exodus, there's no Moses, and no Joshua. But here's the altar, just as it's described in Deuteronomy. Well, it's not really an altar. It's it's a farmhouse or it's a watchtower. Okay, but it's not on top of the mountain and it's short and squatty. Not a very good watchtower. Doesn't have any windows and any doors. Not make a very good farmhouse. What is it? Well, they began to look, and we'll let Adam Zertal, in his own words, tell you the implications of this.
If there was an altar on Mount Ebal, the most ancient and the first Jewish or Israelite altar here, the meaning is that all the story of Deuteronomy and parts of the story in Joshua are scientifically true.
This is, I think, absolutely so, and even the enemies understood it, and so they opposed it. Here we see the altar looking across to Mount Gerizim, where the blessings were read. And one of the things that struck me when I was there, how do you get a group over here and a group that far away and you hear each other? We sent Dr. Willie Dye across to the other side. He has, by the way, 6 earned doctorates, archaeology from Berkeley. He went across and we yelled as loud as we could yell, "Dr. Dye, can you hear us?" He said, "Yeah, I can hear you." The acoustics were just, well, you can't believe it till you're there. It's just astounding. It was apparently just designed to accomplish exactly what was done. As he continued to excavate and look at this area, we find a large complex here where a large group of people were obviously camped. It's been restored to look like this, and obviously this short, squatty building with the ramp going up, no steps, is exactly what we see described in Deuteronomy. Probably looked like this with it's being covered by plaster. And we're reminded there in verse 25 of Exodus 20 that it was not to be made of cut stones. You'll not go up by steps. This is in contrast to all of the Canaanite altars that you might find in the area. But exactly what you find. Well, what do you find in the center? Well, they began to dig down into the center of the area, and they found it was full of ashes. Isn't that a surprise? Some of the vessels there had ashes in them, and they allowed these ashes to be examined at the Department of Zoology at the University of Haifa. They found 942 bones, indicating some 50 to 100 individuals. And what kind of animals were these? If this was a Canaanite altar, they'd be sacrificing eagles and snakes and various animals. But not so with the Israelites. What they found were sheep and goats and cattle, all kosher animals, if you please. And of the ones that they could determine the sex and the age, all of them were 1-year-old males. Wow. This is not a Canaanite altar. It's not a farmhouse. It's not a watchtower. Pottery was also found, and both culturally and with thermoluminescent dating, which is most appropriate for pottery. It was dated to the time of the Exodus, approximately the 13th century. In addition, he found Egyptian scarabs that came from Egypt. This is used often to date Egyptian artifacts. This is from Ramses II, which is probably the one who was reigning at the time of the Exodus, though it's not precise. But generally the time of the Exodus. All of this fits and makes a picture that's just very impressive. But let's notice the statement by Adam Zertal, who was convinced as a result of this and other evidence that he uncovered that the Old Testament was God's Word. And not only that, that the Messiah that the Old Testament predicted was the Christ. He published this material and then made this comment: what has happened regarding the new accumulation of facts I have cited? Almost nothing. Since the appearance of the detailed report and the many articles I have published on the excavation, silence has descended on the scholarly world. They have nothing to say. Well, I do. I think Professor Staggart needs to go back to kindergarten. That's what he said, and I agree with him.